I didn't even think that Bitcoin would get much above $100 in 2010. When I got involved, it was an exciting early crypto libertarian type project of we're bootstrapping a new money. So it's a totally different mindset from today. That was always the plan in 2010 with Bitcoin, is let other blockchains experiment, let other blockchains thrive, let other blockchains take risks. All the things that have been built in the past 15 years are coming to Bitcoin.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed.
Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian here, broadcasting live from Permissionless IV in Brooklyn, New York. Of course, we've got a new guest here who is a fixture of the Bitcoin history. I'm talking about Jeff Garzik, founder of Hemi, someone who has contributed to Bitcoin since all the way back in 2010, first as a Bitcoin core developer and then later now as an entrepreneur in the space. But yeah, we're excited to have this conversation. It's been a long time since we've talked. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Yeah, glad you were able to lasso me, Pete.
Yes. Well, I know backstage, you said some of those memories are starting to fade of the past. I did kind of want to start, I know we're probably going to get into some territory where we maybe have a little bit of a difference of opinion. So I wanted to start with, you were an active participant in the markets early in Bitcoin. This is something maybe you haven't talked about a lot, but you were active on Bitcoin OTC and kind of these trading forums. So you discovered Bitcoin on Slashdot, May of 2010. It's about 6 cents, 7 cents at the time. And you were active in market making and trading and sort of building the Bitcoin economy. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and how it contrasts with what we're seeing today, which is that major financial institutions are doing what you used to do on a very micro level.
Sure. And again, thanks for having me. Thanks for tuning in. Going back in a time machine to the earliest days of my experience in Bitcoin was all about there's no market at all. Famously, Bitcoin Pizza Day, that's when 10,000 Bitcoin were traded for 2 pizzas, and from a macroeconomic perspective, finally it has a price.
Yeah.
And when I got involved, it was an exciting early crypto libertarian type project of we're bootstrapping a new money. So it's a totally different mindset from today. It's what we're doing illegal? Are we violating the Stamp Act or some of these other things? Question mark. Is this ever going to have a price? Question mark. Are we going to have to build out everything ourselves? Are we going to have to build Bitcoin credit cards? Are we going to have to build Bitcoin payment processors, et cetera? Or are the bigs going to integrate us? Or as was the large assumption, are the bigs just going to stomp us? Is the U.S. government? Well, both large TradFi institutions, the Visas, the MasterCards, the big banks, and also the large monetary institutions, the Federal Reserve, U.S. government, other governments. The Bitcoin is theoretically competition for the dollar. As it's playing out now with stablecoins, it's very complementary, but in 2010, is any of that okay? How do you bootstrap a currency? How do you get? And I literally was going to all of my my gardeners and my contractors and folks that work with me in real estate, and in 2010 trying to get them to accept Bitcoin. Just grassroots activism, and the conversations are all about there's this brand new money, and then you have to explain the brand new money. And that's how you create a currency. That's how you create markets. That's how you kind of birth this new monetary thing into being, is with a lot of little individual transactions that collectively form a spot market. So it was all about diving into the monetary biomass.
Did you use Bitcoin before there was like a widely traded price, and did you have to perform your own price calculations on the Bitcoin you were mining?
The earliest Bitcoins, they were being mined on laptops. So you were getting multiples of 50 BTC a day on a single laptop.
Good times, yeah.
So very good times. But you didn't know if it'd have a price at all. It was, you know, there were definitely some true believers in the earliest days, but we didn't know if it would ever have a price.
So did you work it out on like an individual trade basis, like with any of those kind of really early trades, like before there was a price? Like how did you negotiate, and did you complete a trade like back then that you can recall?
No, I was not successful in convincing any of my real estate buddies and contractors to accept Bitcoin, but I definitely tried. But after someone who's long forgotten, and maybe listeners can research this guy, the first real Bitcoin exchange, as far as I'm aware, was created by a pseudonym, Dustin Dollar.
Okay, interesting.
And so
are you thinking about New Liberty Standard, or
that was before this?
That was before this. Okay.
Yeah. So, but this is an exchange that I think didn't live into 2011.
Okay.
And it was the earliest Bitcoin exchange, and that was pre Mt. Gox, pre micro anecdote. I was actually sending money to Jed McCaleb's personal PayPal account in the earliest days of Mt. Gox, user like 47 or something like that. But this was 6 months before Mt. Gox.
Yeah, because I go back and I look at the OTC forum, and this would have been, a kind of a group of 50, 60 people who are maybe trying to trade with each other. You're trading different currencies.
Yep.
You have some trades where people are saying, hey, thanks for the 50 Bitcoin. It was a speedy transaction. You were well rated. But what was it like to participate in that? Because it seems it's so small compared to where we're at today, where nations are accumulating Bitcoin. We have multiple countries that are mining it, right? Like, and you go back, it was maybe like, do you have a sense of how big the community of people you were interacting with was?
It was tiny, under 100 people, absolutely, who were willing to trade, and it was diving into the ecosystem of people will have forgotten these at this time. Pecunix. This was a digital gold. It was pegged to the price of gold, kind of like XAUT from Tether today. Yeah. There was Liberty Reserve.
Linden dollars.
Linden dollars. And so it was all about trading these proto, they were centralized at the time, but proto cryptocurrencies with a real cryptocurrency. And so, hard cash for hard cash. Anytime credit cards or any soft cash appeared, that would instantly get exploited. I really feel bad for the naive folks who set up the first purchased Bitcoin with credit card stuff. It was instantly just rated for all the Bitcoin.
Right? Yeah.
Chargebacks.
When you think about these trades that you made, when you're selling the 50 Bitcoin that you've mined for, probably under $50, in some cases, like how do you think about that as just a life experience that you've had?
For the past decade, Ledger has been the global leader in digital asset security, trusted to secure more than 20% of the world's crypto assets. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger is making digital ownership more secure and accessible with their latest products, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex. These wallets feature the world's first secure touchscreens, simplifying your digital transactions while ensuring uncompromising security through Ledger's secure chip and proprietary OS. Plus, with the Ledger Security Key app, you can say goodbye to traditional passwords and step up your digital protection. Ready to protect your assets? Choose the most trusted name in hardware wallets, Ledger, and take control of your digital security today at ledger.com.
As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research.
It's a thing, it's a thing that happened in the past. It's kind of like owning Apple stock at $4 instead of $400. It's just the early days. I don't spend too much on. I know this is boring for the audience, but I don't spend a lot of memory cycles on the past. It's all about the future.
Well, there's been a cultural change too, right? And it's affected the Bitcoin project in some ways. It's affected how the community perceives Bitcoin, right? You have somebody like a Michael Saylor who's out there, using every kind of debt and leverage instrument in order to accumulate Bitcoin. And the question that they kind of ask is, why wasn't that done, right? Why wasn't that done earlier? Why weren't you, maybe yourself, like having a public company that accumulated Bitcoin and were buying Bitcoin? Because there's a sense. At some point, there was a change, right? Early on, there was a sense, as you said, that you had to evangelize. had to grow the market. You had some responsibility to kind of increase the size of the economy.
Yep.
And now we've switched over to, there are people online who will spend multiple years to just earn a single Bitcoin, right? A single Bitcoin is out of reach for the average person. And so they struggle to understand how you saw Bitcoin back then. And I think they don't really understand why you maybe didn't behave that way earlier. Not you specifically, but the community.
Yeah. Maybe context is I didn't even think that Bitcoin would get much above $100 in 2010. And the folks that were, calling when it was $1 that were calling Bitcoin would hit 100, there were a lot of disbelief out there and stuff like that. You had in the very early days, like Satoshi and Hal Finney's famous conversation, where you just think about plot the scarcity over decades. But there's so many black swans and risk factors along the way in creating a new currency that, where we are is kind of today in 2025 is kind of immaculate conception. It's so,
Right.
It's kind of like, I'm, as you know, deeply involved in space, and it's kind of like we think about Earth itself. It's so improbable that life occurred on Earth. And yet it did, and it's so improbable that Bitcoin, against all odds, is where it is today. And I think it's amazing, and that's a tribute to the engineering and the design and a lot of other factors. But in the early days, you don't think about what it's going to be like in 15 years. You're like, let me make sure this thing doesn't die. Let me make sure jerks on the internet don't DDoS the entire network off the internet. Because in the early days, the cost of attacking Bitcoin is $100.
Right. Something I talked about with Peter Todd yesterday, we did a podcast together. He was also on the main stage at Permissionless. It's just this idea
You talked to Satoshi?
Yeah, HBO's Satoshi. Right? I said the actor best known for his portrayal as Satoshi. It was this idea that today there's this narrative that Bitcoin is fully formed, and perhaps maybe was always fully formed. Obviously, for people who've been around a long time, I find that assertion pretty uncomfortable. But there's this idea that I struggle with, where at a certain point early on, as a developer, your work on Bitcoin as a software directly impacted the value of Bitcoin and probably the price as well. And then I think you can probably make the argument today that technical development no longer drives Bitcoin price. I think that's an uncontroversial statement today. But it's unclear sort of when that changed, right? You can't really kind of draw a line and say, this was the point at which Bitcoin development was no longer kind of the single factor boosting price. This is a bit of a segue, because I think if we look back at kind of the time of like where technical development in Bitcoin was so contentious, it dominated these conferences, right? You would be on stage having arguments with people, and there would be throngs of people around you hanging on your words, trying to figure out where Bitcoin was going. But I think it came from this idea that Bitcoin development was meaningful for the price. That doesn't seem like the case anymore. So when does that, looking back, when do you think that ended, or what's your assessment?
2017.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, Bitcoin development basically stopped.
Well, some of it's continued on the second layer in other areas, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But the core layer, it's ossified. It's not changing. OpCat, OpCLTV, they're not happening.
But I guess, again, the assertion of some of these kind of, the people who don't know the past, they didn't live through it, right? You'll hear commonly it said that, Satoshi gifted this gift to the world, right? And you must find that uncomfortable, because you found a software that was poorly written, had a bunch of bugs, and wouldn't have maybe been as valuable without your efforts. Or do you think that Bitcoin could have succeeded? Let's just say if there was never any of the development that you and Gavin and other early developers did, like, do you think that Bitcoin would still be as successful as it is?
Oh, absolutely. It's emergent behavior. I'm of the Fight Club generation. None of us are special, unique, amazing snowflakes.
So you don't think that your decisions and upgrades on Bitcoin like had a meaningful impact on the price?
There would have been other Gavins. There would have been other Jeff Garziks.
Okay.
It's just.
But there weren't.
Emergent behavior is when you have something like this is inevitable, I think. And so it's kind of like when you have ants clustering together as a colony, they're not individually thinking about a grand strategy, but nature and DNA just have them move as a mass, in certain Darwinian survival situations. And same thing with Bitcoin itself is, once it starts to hit the mainstream in a very small way, it's viral. And the network effects, I think, guarantee either death or success. There's no it muddles along in libertarian obscurity. So either, even if there was no Jeff, there was no Gavin, Bitcoin would probably be, I'd say, further along without the 2017 kind of pump the brakes kind of development. I think the price would be far beyond where it is today. But would Bitcoin exist or not? It would absolutely exist without any of the current cadre. None of us are unique snowflakes. It's the power of Bitcoin, the power of the algorithm, the power of self-balancing, the need for decentralization. All these exist in the environment. I knew in 1990 that Bitcoin was inevitable, and I talked about that in a lot of speeches, is decentralized currency meets a number of needs that nation states don't meet. And so once a successful design exists and is proven, it's going to get grabbed, it's going to get used, and that's what happened.
Well,
so that's the Bitcoin inevitability, regardless of any one person thesis.
Right. So I do think there was someone in the Bitcoin culture early on who put forward that thesis. It was unpopular at the time. It was Moshe Popescu. He decided to essentially freeze the software of Bitcoin at the Satoshi's last version and say, hey, these developers are jokers. I'm not going to use their stuff. Bitcoin's perfect as is. So you really don't think, so you think if there had been...
I'm impressed that you even name dropped that name. No one watching this knows that name. I know it.
I know that name. Yeah.
I know that name, but
right.
I'm impressed.
Right, but that was a controversial idea because Bitcoin development was seen as such an important part of the thing. But so you're saying that you think that the code, because it sounds like you would agree with them, that the code as Satoshi published it would be just as valuable today if there had been never an upgrade.
Yep. It would be just as valuable. It wouldn't be as high quality, but it would be just as valuable.
Okay, and then
so there's the organic outcome analysis, then there's the engineering. Let me look at the code analysis. The organic, just what is the outcome analysis? Even ugly code gets used if there are users.
So why do you think, again, we lived through a time of Bitcoin technical development where there was a lot of strife, right? I traveled around the world and I watched grown men sort of yell at each other about Bitcoin technical developments, and it felt like it mattered, right? I remember being in these rooms where Chinese miners were trying to talk to American developers through translators, and it felt like you were watching a grand sort of diplomatic, sort of UN style kind of important thing. So what do you think about all this energy that
not a Japanese American warrior type TV show?
No, more like a what's that movie where the movies that are set in diplomacy. There's a lot of chair swiveling, right?
12 Angry Men.
Right. Yeah, something like that. Courtroom drama, right? But so where do you think that came from? What is that? And if that wasn't important to Bitcoin, how should we view that sort of the developer interest in Bitcoin as a technology?
Well, that's 40 questions in one question.
It's a lot of questions, yeah.
I would say that, again, outcome-wise, Bitcoin would be naturally emergent.
Well, that means you didn't have to fly around the world and have those arguments, and you think you could have just stayed at home.
But, Bitcoin is a network. It's a social network. It's not a monetary network. It's a social network. And that was just, people are tribal. People inevitably have intertribal struggles. And so the emergence of that was pretty much natural. It was just, a cadre wants to control what happens in Bitcoin. And so politics naturally emerged from that.
Right. So, I think that's why the kind of modern Bitcoin culture, I think, wants to erase kind of the development process from Bitcoin and their positioning from it because it's uncomfortable. It does kind of get us into this idea that there are different stakeholders within Bitcoin that influence outcomes, whether it's miners, users running nodes, or businesses. And that feels like what the fork war kind of period from 2014 to 17 really was trying to litigate, was figuring out who within this decentralized network had what powers. what is your assessment?
Somewhat. I mean, it's the ethos of not wanting to be led leads to strange outcomes when leadership is needed. And so that's essentially what happened.
But you did try to step up and be a leader at times.
I tried to, kind of bring people together, which was what I felt was, there's some crazy people over here, but what's the pragmatic in the middle solution?
And is that because partly you thought that it wasn't maybe as important as most people thought it was, or did you think it was really important? Because again, I think it felt really important at the time.
It's one of many things. I'm far more involved in like energy abundance and space settlement and other things that I would rank in importance. It was libertarian squabble, in a dank basement where they play D&D is where I'd rank it.
Okay. But there's this idea of like who or what controls Bitcoin or influences Bitcoin, right? And it's still today, right? With Bitcoin knots and Bitcoin Core, there's some echoes of kind of these earlier struggles, right? In your mind, it does feel like back then there was more of an idea that businesses were important, right? That businesses' use of the protocol was something that would be prioritized or at least
that's more of like the the people who eventually owned the veto-ocracy. That was some of their political stripe.
A veto-ocracy, sorry.
Yeah, Vitalik accurately describes Bitcoin governance as a veto-ocracy.
Oh, and can you explain that a bit?
Basically, changes go in unless they're vetoed, and it's very easy to veto a change, and so that's how we get like very little going through Bitcoin.
So maybe to kind of go to the end of that period, there were some outcomes, right? So one of the outcomes was that there were multiple projects that forked off of Bitcoin and then tried to compete in the market and sort of, try to displace Bitcoin.
Doomed to fail from the beginning.
Right. You were not publicly involved with either Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin SV.
Nope.
Right. And so you were involved with the SegWit2x kind of, attempt to increase the block size for the businesses. So why be involved in that project?
No, that wasn't for the businesses. It was I know this is an overloaded term, but research-backed, Satoshi's vision for Bitcoin was to keep updating the block size, keep increasing the block size. Very well documented, very well known. And it was taking a right turn in Bitcoin's economics to deviate from that expected course. So it wasn't a for the businesses fork. That's propaganda.
Right. Well, I think the technical community took a different view and ultimately moved forward with that. But I guess my point was, why didn't you find those other projects interesting? Because I think looking back,
because they were doomed to fail,
just by nature of them being forks, just out of the gate.
It's not Bitcoin. It's not interesting, and they're not Bitcoin. There was a little game in 2017 of let's call this other thing Bitcoin, but it wasn't Bitcoin. It was Bitcoin Cash. That was a little just narrative game, but it didn't have the POW behind it. It didn't have any of the stakeholders behind it. It's a different network. Bitcoin, always a social network first.
So what do you think we learned from that, the failures of those other forks specifically?
Nothing. I knew that they were going to fail from the beginning, and so learned no lessons. It proved me right, and I continue to be proven right again and again.
Okay. So I was kind of talking with some of these subjects with Peter Todd yesterday, and I asked him the question about the developers driving price, and his standpoint is that the most recent example of this was Lightning. That adding Lightning to Bitcoin dramatically increased Bitcoin's valuation and its ability to...
Oh, he's smoking opium. That is totally BS. Lightning is a failure. Very few people are using Lightning right now. And it was a red herring to pump Lightning instead of alternate working solutions like Layer 2s. So Bitcoin community basically froze itself in time for several years on a bad sidetrack to the Lightning network.
So there does seem like there's now a bit of a referendum on that time period, even within mainstream Bitcoin, right? So some of the things that you just said that are controversial, but they're being said, right? So you're hearing people say that Lightning maybe wasn't the right direction. You're hearing some soul searching on that time
Well,
period.
I mean, it's not subjective. You can look at the literal amount of Bitcoin locked on the Lightning Network, and it's 1/100th of what's on WBTC, what's on Ethereum, what's on Hemi. So it's a dwarf.
But it is usable, right? I can send you money on a Lightning wallet. You can receive it.
Yeah, but there are dozens of useful technologies on Bitcoin that no one uses.
Okay, so where does your so you mentioned Vitalik earlier. Maybe we'll wind back a little bit in terms of the movement of creating cryptocurrencies outside of Bitcoin. Yeah, that's something that you wanted to see and that you encouraged. I remember from your forum posts, you broadly said that you wanted to see experiments away from Bitcoin to see more projects get spun up, and you felt like there would be many blockchains. How do you still think that the cryptocurrency industry beyond Bitcoin is trying to solve useful problems and doing something useful?
For the past decade, Ledger has been the global leader in digital asset security, trusted to secure more than 20% of the world's crypto assets. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger is making digital ownership more secure and accessible with their latest products, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex. These wallets feature the world's first secure touchscreens, simplifying your digital transactions while ensuring uncompromising security through Ledger's secure chip and proprietary OS. Plus, with the Ledger Security Key app, you can say goodbye to traditional passwords and step up your digital protection. Ready to protect your assets? Choose the most trusted name in hardware wallets, Ledger, and take control of your digital security today at ledger.com.
As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research.
Well, it's always inevitable. If you don't encourage innovation, then it quickly becomes a totalitarian fascist environment. Mm-hmm. And so if you got to be open source, if you're going to be decentralized, you're going to be permissionless, then you got to encourage innovation. Mm-hmm. And so what I saw in the kind of 2017 era of Bitcoin and what we saw with developers fleeing to Ethereum and other places like Solana is it was very anti-innovation. Once you're in Bitcoin maxi land, it's like everything is poop coin except for my coin. Mm-hmm. And that just is a signal of a closed mind who is not evaluating data actively, just making a blanket assumption and then saying, oh, I don't need to evaluate data because I made my assumption. So it's just a signal of a closed mind and a signal of just macroeconomic ignorance. Because when the cost of digital asset creation is zero, when the cost of blockchain creation is zero, you're going to get flooded with tokens. You're going to get the 60,000 token a day Solana pump.fund stuff. You're going to get thousands of Bitcoin L2s, thousands of Ethereum L2s. But at the same time, we're open source. We're permissionless, we're decentralized, we're open network. And so that naturally emerges from all of those things. You just have to trust in power law that 99.9% of these will just melt away in Darwin's trial by fire, and the remaining 0.1%, Bitcoin, Ethereum, et cetera, that have staying power, those are the ones that A, you want to be on, but B, you want to look at the Darwin trial by fire and see what are the lessons learned. That was always the plan in 2010 with Bitcoin, is let other blockchains experiment, let other blockchains thrive, let other blockchains take risks. And then after that period, when they've succeeded or failed or whatever, you can take that technology that's now been tested in the best test lab in the world, the internet, the real world, and start to incorporate it either into Bitcoin or Bitcoin L2s.
Well, there does seem to be a trough of disillusionment within the crypto space right now. I would say that, if the extent that Bitcoin is leading the market and is as big as it is, it's surprising to a lot of people, right? In 2017, it was broadly seen that there was, and this was the narrative at the time, right, that other technologies were surpassing Bitcoin and that they would supplant Bitcoin. That hasn't played out.
Those are the crypto marketers. They're smoking their own opium.
Okay, right. So that was the narrative at the time. Now I think it's adjusted to Bitcoin is sort of seen as the digital gold within this environment of other coins. But it does seem like those coins are broadly trending towards zero, almost all of them. And even with Ethereum, there are serious questions about how viable it will be for how much longer, people migrating to other things. So again, I think the question that I asked was like, what do you think that it's possible to achieve in systems outside of Bitcoin? When we've seen the trajectory, it seems like what other buzzwords can kind of come out and form around these communities, right? Like what?
Well, all the things that have been built in the past 15 years are coming to Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. So again, it's the Solanas of the world can be thought as a beta test for what works and doesn't work.
That sounds like a Bitcoin maximalist position.
It's OG logic. It's not a maximalist position. It's a Bitcoin POV of you can go and you can test stuff, but we'll still be here at the end of the day, which is always true. And our thesis at Hemi is Bitcoin and Ethereum have the most staying power when you look at not only technical, and people make all the mistakes in the world of just looking at this blockchain has these features, therefore success. There's so much more to blockchain success in the social realm, which is why I call Bitcoin a social network, that leads to, X-Tech type evaluations of how much institutional support is there, how much banking support is there, how much regulatory clarity is there. In each of those, Bitcoin is at the top category. And so it's not a religious belief. It's just a pragmatic evaluation of, okay, this is most likely to be on corporate balance sheets. Therefore, this is most likely to be in sovereign wealth funds. Therefore. And so it's a pragmatic, if Ethereum was where Bitcoin is today, I'd make the same evaluation, but it's not.
Right. So maybe let's stick with Ethereum for a second, because I'm trying to understand where you're coming from with it. Because I think that I see Ethereum. I think many people make, a category error that Ethereum was primarily a technology community, where I think it was really a social movement towards trying to do things outside of Bitcoin. You can see that, and they made a lot of assertions in their design, like they were very dissatisfied with proof of work mining. They wanted to move towards something else. Even though now proof of work mining, I think, maybe more broadly embraced for some of the reasons that they wanted to solve problems that are maybe no longer problems, right? And so how do you evaluate, what did Ethereum achieve to you? And when it was starting out, how did you view it?
Well, Ethereum did what Bitcoin didn't, which was gave us DeFi. Is you can have autonomous robots, meaning smart contracts, and you can interact with those robots, and they will not be corruptible. They will be predictable. They will be, do exactly as you expect. They will be neutral referees, and that's all of the things that you wanted on a blockchain. And so Ethereum gives you all of that, and Bitcoin still hasn't given you that. It doesn't have autonomous self-actuating addresses.
But they sacrificed on things like the economic side, and now they're kind of even revising the issuance schedule and things like that. So they cut a lot of corners to get there. So why do you think
nobody cares about that?
Well,
nobody cares.
But it does seem like
developers went to Ethereum because it was far more buildable.
Well, the corporate treasury people, I think, care, right? I think that if you're buying Bitcoin, if you're buying a cryptocurrency for a corporate balance sheet, the data will show that you're far more likely to buy Bitcoin than Ethereum. So somebody cares about that.
They don't care about like smart contracts and all those low-level details. The institutionals, the sovereigns that are buying Bitcoin is because it has staying power. It's been there longer. And it's far more mature, it's far more seasoned. And so once Ethereum has another 5 years of life in it, you'll see it being held at more institutions.
But you don't think that Ethereum is being kind of outmoded by Solana? No.
You have to reboot Solana every month. So the quality isn't there, the predictability isn't there, the Microsoft Windows old joke of if Microsoft made a car, it'd go 1,000 miles an hour, randomly explode and crash. That's kind of the experience. So what is predictability? What is staying power? What is the grand central station of crypto? And that's Ethereum. People are going through Ethereum to get to L2s. They're going through Ethereum to do stuff with their BTC, with wrap BTC. Obviously, self-plug. Hemi is competing for that. The grand central station nature of it, the EVM, JVM nature of it, it just doesn't. None of the other blockchains compete. They're all new kids on the block. You don't have the audit support. This is one of the big lessons in Red Hat and Linux, is software actually changes really slowly when you think about backwards compatibility. And someone has been using this piece of Linux for like 10 years in their factory, and they really don't want to patch every month. And so they don't care about the latest updates. They just care about stability, predictability. And so when you're updating software, you're doing audits, and Ethereum has the best audit community. Solana, far and away less InfoSec prowess. If you are going to institutionals and talking crypto, it's either going to be Bitcoin, Ethereum, or nothing. Sovereigns is Bitcoin or nothing, a little bit of Ethereum. And you're just not hearing any other blockchain because of the seasoning, the maturity, the time in market. And Bitcoin, and only Bitcoin, has that number one slot. And it's always going to have that number one slot.
But there's a yin and yang here, right, between the software and the economics part. And if Ethereum ultimately has...
That's propaganda.
What in what regard?
People overthink Ethereum economics all the time, and it's more about what people are using versus not using that drives the economics. It's not about some thing that's going to happen in 4 years or 10 years or 100 years. Nobody plots that out.
Well, I think if you were to ask most people in 2014, 2015, what Bitcoin would have to do to accrue the value it's accrued, they would have said Bitcoin needs to be the layer for application. And this was a refrain from Silicon Valley. So Chris Dixon, you can find his old tweets, said this, is that Bitcoin needs to be the layer for applications for money, and that's what's going to drive value. Bitcoin has not succeeded at that, and yet the value accretion has been massive compared to. I mean, Bitcoin right now is 7x larger than Ethereum, and so I think the question that's pretty natural is that, okay, if you have all these bells and whistles, DeFi's, DEXs, whatever, if that hasn't been enough to outcompete Bitcoin, then how does that stuff not end up going back to Bitcoin simply because it's a stronger economic ecosystem?
Because Bitcoin can't do any of that stuff.
But doesn't Hemi, isn't what you're working on helping address that?
Absolutely, and we're building on Ethereum technology to do it.
Right, and so your project requires Ethereum to continue to exist.
Yep.
Okay, can you expound on that a bit?
Well, that's every EVM project requires Ethereum to exist, and so every EVM project ultimately is feeding up to both Ethereum and, in our case, with super finality, proof-of-proof mining, et cetera, Bitcoin as well.
Well, that's why with Rootstock, I mean, they have an EVM compatible, but there's no kind of Ethereum elements. So what part of the Ethereum?
But they will instantly fall behind if they don't update their Ethereum engine for bugs, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so there's a continuous stream of software updates. There's not just, okay, we have an EVM. EVM itself continues to change every year. They continue to add ZK features and other features. And so it's not just they have an EVM, period, end of story. They have an outdated EVM that needs to get updated.
I had Sergio Lerner on the podcast a few weeks ago. He's working on a new version of BitVM. This is, essentially a virtual machine for Bitcoin, a layer 2 that would have a pretty trust minimized setup.
Our custody vaults on Hemi are going to use kind of BitVM 2.5, where the community is moving on to BitVM 3. They kind of don't like BitVM 2.
Well, why are you?
But we're kind of 2.5. We're kind of a hybrid design.
Why are you bullish on BitVM specifically? And what will it bring to Bitcoin when we start seeing things get deployed like Citria and all these other things?
Well, the biggest problem, going back 15 years ago was the two-way peg.
Right,
you can go out to a side chain, but coming back is a far more difficult proof cycle. You've got to have hot wallets and other kind of off-chain validator type networks, federated networks. And that would, kind of still keep some projects back in the steam engine era of Bitcoin. And multi-party federated systems are really, that's like 2010 technology. We got to eject that. We got to launch that from orbit. And BitVM 2, 2.5, 3, merge mining to a lesser degree, even though that's cartelized. proof-of-proof mining, similar technologies like that are what's going to advance, in my opinion.
Well, the Bitcoin core technical community, I think, has largely held up this idea of unilateral exit as being the thing that defines whether something is part of Bitcoin, right? So there's a lot of criticism about BitVM, sort of other L2 constructions, as being inferior to Lightning in the regard that, there's no trustlessness, right? What they're trying to work through is trustlessness. Things like these BitVM and new L2s are approaching trustlessness, but not fully trustless. And so they haven't been appropriated into kind of the intellectual mental model. So how do you see that resolving? Do you think that these L2 structures will be so successful that the Bitcoin kind of worldview will have to accommodate them? Or how do you think about that?
Again, Lightning is a dead end. And so people who are cheering for Lightning are cheering for, evolutionary dead end. It's kind of like the turtles on the Galapagos Islands. You just look at them from afar. Mm-hmm. So the L2s are going to be where the capital is at. So that's going to be where ultimately the development continues to iterate.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think capital will flow to the L2s?
That's already where it's going, and it makes Bitcoin far more programmable. Lightning is just a layer about moving around tokens rapidly, whereas L2s like Hemi are expanding the ability to program Bitcoin itself. For example, on Hemi specifically, we embedded a Bitcoin node inside our Ethereum node, inside the EVM, to add Bitcoin opcodes such that your Hemi smart contract can be actuating things on BTC L1, be triggered by things on BTC L1, but the programming is happening on L2. So it's essentially an extension of programmer power to a much, much, much greater degree. And Lightning doesn't offer anything like that. And all the layer 2s offer that as just table stakes.
I'm going to be honest. I struggle sometimes with your mental model, just because I spend a lot of time talking to different people in the space and getting their different kind of perceptions of how they view things. Because you make a lot of statements that just kind of seem a bit contrarian, right? So you're saying that Bitcoin will succeed. It will keep appreciating in value, and then the other, Ethereum is where the developer mindshare that will continue to kind of grow. So in regards to the Bitcoin,
that's not contradictory.
Well,
both happen at the same time.
Well, I think what I'm trying to understand is the Bitcoin technical community works in a certain way right now, right? It's this meritocracy where people are kind of working on bugs, proposing fixes. It's really slowed down in terms of the consensus changes. How do you think Bitcoin development should be working? If you also can see that it could have never happened, and maybe it was never necessary, because those seem kind of at odds, right? If Bitcoin development was never necessary, then why does it matter that the Bitcoin kind of development community process is the way that it is?
I think that's putting words in my mouth. I never said that Bitcoin development wasn't necessary.
Well, I was trying to understand and I think we spent a lot of earlier times in the podcast trying to talk about when was the period that it wasn't as necessary, right?
I think it's always been necessary. It's just been log jammed.
Right. So
that's the whole veto-ocracy thing.
Right. So how do you think that it should be working today is, I guess, what I'm trying to understand, because right now it does function, in a certain way. And what's the alternative to what?
Well, I dispute that it functions. I don't see any consensus changes coming out.
Right.
There's a lot of what we call in software development putting lipstick on a pig, doing UI changes in the wallet, nothing to do with consensus. Changing test suites, nothing to do with consensus.
Well, why does consensus
splitting out programs, nothing to do with consensus.
Why does consensus have to be changing and evolving?
Well, if it doesn't, then Bitcoin ossifies where it is today.
Right. But what's the problem with that? If it's successful and it's finding a lot of value and people are building stuff on it that will increase the value and utility? It's
it's not an absolute evaluation, it's a relative evaluation. If it's not ossified, should the value be 10x where it is today? Right now development is stunted, limited, veto-ocracy controlled. And what would the value be if Bitcoin was unleashed?
Mm-hmm.
So,
But what does that and to you unleashed means what bringing back or accommodating kind of what Ethereum has been able to achieve?
Oh, it means just don't be ossified. Accept changes to Bitcoin to, handle covenants or handle, I think OpCat and OpCLTV are just fine. And each one of those perfectly safe, very well tested for years. Definitely adds to Bitcoin. Should have been added years and years and years ago.
Well, we do seem like we're approaching ossification. It does seem that the Bitcoin community, by and large, is very supportive of this, right? There aren't many folks calling for changes. I think Michael Saylor and others have been of the vanguard of trying to push this idea that Bitcoin is just as fine. We shouldn't improve it.
Yep.
So you disagree with that view?
Well, at this point, I kind of, just accept what comes. I don't really have much of a view. I think that, like I just said, it's, ossified and been turned down and stunted and limited as to where it could have been. But is that going to change? Should that change? I don't really have an opinion on that.
What's your view of kind of the development, there's some drama right now kind of in the development community about how much power the users have versus what the developers kind of should be doing in terms of making policy changes. Some of them are kind of referendums on things you were involved in with OpReturn a decade ago. So you just see this as a part of the stunting of the community that we're still sort of having these same debates.
It's still the vetoocracy. I haven't seen anything change. You always look at the filter of outcome. What consensus changes? There's noise, there's debates, there's blah should happen. What is the outcome? That always cuts through all the noise, always cuts through all the BS.
Maybe let me ask this question a different way. In a world where SegWit 2x gets activated, I think there was a hope of a lot of the investors and sort of people who were behind that movement that was a sort of a direct response to the enthusiasm and momentum of the Ethereum community in a lot of ways. In a world where we went down that path, obviously Ethereum still exists and it would probably be as successful as it is today. So how do you think about what would have happened had we gone down that path as like a culture and community?
Bitcoin would have more features, more value,
because
more users.
Because there would have been more
and they wouldn't have chased, developers away to Solana and ETH with Vitriol. Yeah.
But it also seems like at the same time that those developers are coming back because what they're building elsewhere isn't working.
Well, they're coming back with those technologies, which is, again, what we predicted in July 2010 of, you're in Bitcoin, your Bitcoin point of view is everyone else go out, beta test these features, come back to Bitcoin with trial by fire, innovated, filtered tech. And that's what they're doing. And that's what we're doing with Hemi. EVM, trial by fire, Bitcoin, trial by fire. And you bring those two together, it's super well-tested components that you can trust. It's not a let's reboot the chain every month, nitro experiment.
But from the conservative perspective, or the people who kind of, maybe take a conservative approach, wouldn't you want to see a reality where a lot of these applications are successful and working prior to making consensus change? I'll give you an example. Ordinals and kind of the Bitcoin assets explosion, right? There was a lot of people who wanted to use that as justification to kind of accelerate development to accommodate some of those things. Now we've seen that a lot of that enthusiasm and user momentum and those applications have gone away. So that kind of continues this conversation about, okay, when is something going to be successful enough for us to implement? Do you think it's possible that maybe we will do that at some point? It's just we haven't reached the threshold that where most people who are using Bitcoin, think there's a reason to do that.
Well, again, it's you're beta testing elsewhere and then bringing it back to Bitcoin, and that hasn't changed, and that thesis remains. And the upgradability is, at the time, 2017, it was very well studied. What is the new feature? It's going to be big capacity. The features of
larger blocks.
Yeah, the features of covenants, opcats, stuff like that.
But right now, there's almost no transactions on Bitcoin, right? Blocks are fairly empty.
Yep.
Right. But so that
dot.
Well, I'm saying so. Some people will say your assertion that it was well studied, the network could handle larger blocks, but we've arguably maybe don't need them. We've scaled the community of users.
Well, the way it happens is you burst to the water pipe's maximum size. And if you have a very small water pipe, then network fees just go parabolic, as they had been doing. And with a larger water pipe, they don't go parabolic, and they can handle much more transaction bursts. And SEG would prove that just as well as, a larger block size would have proven that.
Well, maybe wind down with an observation I've made before, which is that the problem with problem solving is you have to agree on the problem. And it does seem like we've struggled in Bitcoin to define problems. And the nature of problems is like sometimes they change. How do you get a sense of how we should deal with that, though? Because essentially, right, large blocks are seen as a solution to a problem, but arguably that problem no longer exists. But it sounds like you're arguing that had the solution been put in place at the time, the problem would have been solved, and we wouldn't be in the situation we are now. It's like hard for me to follow the logic a bit.
That's like a 40-part question.
How would you prefer to answer it? I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it. Because it seems like, how do you get consensus on a problem in a distributed system where there's so much money involved and there's so much tension? Like, how does that happen?
Yeah, well, that was the problem in 2010. That was the problem in 2014, 2017, and, hasn't really changed. That's the Bitcoin governance model. That's why it's called a vetoocracy.
That sounds kind of like negative. Like the vetoocracy sounds like a negative description of that process.
It's basically how Bitcoin got ossified. And so there's not going to be any other changes because vetoocracy.
And you still think that some other process could have emerged and did emerge on Ethereum. That's why you see that Ethereum as being valuable. Is that fair?
It's a different model. Bitcoin chose not to upgrade. Ethereum chose to upgrade, and both are valid models, and we're using both in Hemi. It's not one or the other.
So is that why you particularly see Ethereum as having a long-term value, simply because the development process is so radically different?
No, it's all about outcome, and you're talking inputs. I'm talking outputs. What are the outputs? Are a backwards compatible programmable machine that we can graft to Bitcoin to make Bitcoin even more programmable. So that was the whole point of EVM. That was the whole point of us starting Hemi. That was the whole point of pop mining. Was we need to bring both worlds together. It's not about this is a great development model. It's about what is the outcome. That was Animals in Translation. Google it. Animals in Translation by Dr. Temple Grandin. She's an autist. She's autistic. And she made cows in farms incredibly much more healthy because she stopped looking at the inputs and she started looking at the outputs. Inputs are the government makes a ton of rules about, we think this is how cows get healthy. The outputs are, can the cows walk? Do they look sick? Just measure outcomes, and all the noise, all the inputs just fade away. All the BS, all the this opinion, that opinion, what is the outcome?
But don't the inputs influence the outcome?
Absolutely. But everyone focuses far too much on inputs and ignores the outcome. There's like, okay, this developer community, therefore this outcome. You can't correlate in a complex system one input to one output. And so you just have to look at outcomes, because inputs, there are like so many inputs that you don't even see. So many conversations you don't even see. So, the mental model is be humble, assume that, I am blind to 80% of the conversations and 80% of the inputs. My 20% of the inputs that I can see are giving me a misleading impression. Outputs, outcomes, real TVL, real transaction flows, those are measurable, those are provable.
But aren't some of those transaction flows, and again, we saw this with even just kind of using a Bitcoin intrinsic example with ordinals and Bitcoin assets and things like that. There is those transactions and signals existed, but they were kind of created artificially, and they were sort of doomed to kind of eventually just go to zero because they were kind of coming from venture capital and different kind of speculative areas. And maybe even the NFT boom in 2021 with the crypto land, right? A lot of this money came in from money printing from the United States and mailing checks to everybody. This gets rolled over into NFTs. This gets rolled over into DeFi.
Well, ZIRP went into Bitcoin as well. Plenty of ZIRP money went into Bitcoin.
Sure. But in the standpoint of, if you think of, a crypto conference 3 years ago, it looks much different than this conference today, right? Here you have the kind of the hardened builders. There you would have seen euphoria. There would have been parties. There would have been lots of people there. In terms of, that's an example, I think, where, you're able to kind of see if you're measuring, because your assertion is that you're measuring outcome, right? An outcome of transaction volume and utility and users. In a lot of cases, the activities that they were doing have kind of gone away, right? The NFT market is gone. It's likely not coming back in any significant size. But you're saying that outcome is still materially interesting and validates the crypto side of the system.
And that's part of the mental model of evaluation I'm talking about is the inputs into that included ZIRP.
Right.
And so if we didn't have ZIRP, there would have been far less irrational exuberance, in all quarters, crypto, non-crypto, Bitcoin, non-Bitcoin. And so focusing on, is it just, NFTs as a, cause? NFTs were a symptom of global macroeconomic policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I think about, just going back to maybe Ethereum for a second, with Vitalik, a lot of his early writings of like what he wanted to achieve with Ethereum, it just looks very different from what Ethereum looks like today, right? He's talking a lot about kind of like different kind of income sort of generating schemes and kind of quadratic voting, right? Like this idea that we would have different governance or innovations in governance. And so how do you match that, right? So there's this kind of big philosophical question of is Bitcoin...
He's wildly succeeding. I mean, none of that shit is happening on Bitcoin. It's all happening on Ethereum. All those experiments, all that innovation, all those developers running those experiments, vast majority of them on EVM and not on Bitcoin.
Well, I think the question I was going to ask is to what extent is the system the result of ultimately inputs, right? Because Bitcoin was started by someone with an intent that still defines the system today, right? Bitcoin is still the product of Satoshi's vision and intent and his specific design in the same way Ethereum is the product of Vitalik's specific vision and design now.
They have an input, but it's not, again, you can't draw a straight line from inputs to outputs. They're a product of the social networks. So Bitcoin, product of a social network, Ethereum is a social network, Solana is a social network, and they evolve socially and evolutionarily and biologically.
So, but won't they progress towards one social network of money at some point?
They seem not to. The tribal incentives, and every single human being on the planet has tribal DNA and tribal thinking in their brain. We're pre-wired to believe dogma rather than think through dogma. And so ultimately, the human nature of being tribal plays into the natural intrinsics of crypto macroeconomics. And so that's where meme coins come from, just like that's where outside crypto land where conspiracy theories come from. It's just purely tribal dogma. If you have Rizzo coin and I'm your best bud, I want Rizzo coin. And it's not about evaluating, shitcoin or not shitcoin. It's people naturally group in herds. People want to be social. And crypto, each individual crypto coin is a vector for socialization. And so people will naturally always gravitate first dogmatically and then rationally in that order.
This is maybe kind of ending on a wider question. Why do you still work on Bitcoin? There's a lot of kind of people from your generation of Bitcoin. I'm the generation after your progenitor generation. A lot of them are gone. They're retired elsewhere, enjoying the spoils of kind of that early period. Or some of them maybe moved on to other things and maybe. Lost it all, right? We know people who have kind of both ends of that spectrum. What drives you to continue kind of doing the work that you're doing?
Freedom for humanity. It's ultimately about self-sovereignty, payment freedom, censorship resistance, and we keep building decentralized systems to eventually achieve that goal.
And so to you, even if development maybe wasn't necessary for Bitcoin, you still think that working on expanding the whole set of what's useful here is worth your time and effort and energy.
That's why it's always about outcome. It's never about Bitcoin. It's about what is the shortest path to freedom for 8 billion people. And right now the answer is Bitcoin. But if the pragmatic answer is something different, I'm going in a different direction because it's about humanity, not about Bitcoin.
When you think about what's going to happen when, this idea that Bitcoin and crypto systems are going to get much bigger, stable coins next year are going to be mainstream. This industry does feel like it's about to really be integrated in the financial system. I mean, what do you think happens when that happens?
Bitcoin lives alongside gold. Bitcoin is, it's ossified and, into a I hold it and do something else elsewhere with it kind of pattern. And so that's the way things are going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Bitcoin's not going away, but it's not upgrading either. It's going to be the backbone, the root of the crypto tree, the trunk of the crypto tree. And every incentive in network effect points back to Bitcoin. And so I don't see any of those incentives changing, so I don't see the outcome changing.
And you also don't see a scenario where Bitcoin would have failed against that proposition, no matter what anyone did in this drama.
Not so far.
Okay.
But that's the pragmatic outcome. That's the pragmatic evaluation. It's not about, I've got Solana bags, so Solana's going to succeed. It's, what achieves human freedom, and Bitcoin is the most likely but not certain answer to that question.
Jeff, appreciate you being here. Hemi, where can people find out more about it? Where can they
Hemi.xyz and follow us on Hemi_XYZ on X.
And is there a good place to see what applications and things people are building on there?
Hemi.xyz, our application section of the portal.
Well, Jeff, I appreciate it. It's been an interesting conversation. I appreciate everybody tuning in. Once again, we're Permissionless IV live in Brooklyn, New York. We're interested in you joining us in digital assets. I'm in London this fall. Go to blockworks.co. You can learn more about that coming conference, as well as get some discounts and some other special things on the website, as well as the videos of what you're seeing here. Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian. This has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.